A supervisor humiliated an old maintenance worker in front of his whole crew for flagging the same door 4 times. 6 days later, 4 federal agents were staged in the walls because of that door. The badge clipped to Frank Delaney's gray coverall said VACTech, Terminal C, and for 6 years that was the only thing anybody at Sacramento Metro Airport bothered to know about him. He was 61, built like a fence post, quiet in a way people mistook for slow. He showed up at 5 a.m., drank his coffee black out of a dented steel thermos, and spent his shifts crawling through the guts of the terminal. Return air chases, mechanical rooms, the crawl spaces above the ceiling tiles where nobody else wanted to go. His hands were scarred in a way that didn't match 40 years of changing filters. Nobody asked. Frank didn't talk about the 22 years he'd spent doing things the U-S government would neither confirm nor deny. He didn't talk about Kandahar or Mosul, or the 11 months in a country that technically didn't have any American personnel in it, according to the official record. When people asked what he did before KVAC, he said government contractor, and let their eyes glaze over, because that was exactly the reaction he wanted. His supervisor, a terminal operations manager named Russ Kowalczyk, had exactly one opinion about Frank Delaney. The man was a pain in the ass. "You flagged the maintenance tunnel access door by gate C14 again," Russ said, standing in the doorway of the mechanical room with a clipboard in one hand and irritation stamped across his face. "That's the 3rd work order this month. There's nothing wrong with that door, Frank. Panic bar's been rigged to stay latched, even when it reads unlocked on the BMs," Frank said, not looking up from the condenser coil he was cleaning. "Somebody's been testing." If you enjoy stories of courage, justice, and redemption, subscribe to our channel. Then drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to welcome you. Somebody's been using it. It's a service corridor, catering, baggage, cleaning crews. 40 people a day go through there. Russ tapped the clipboard against his thigh. "You know what corporate told me last quarter? Your ticket count is triple everybody else's on this crew. Triple. You're not fixing more things, Frank. You're finding more things to fix. That's the job. The job is filters, coils, belts, and not costing me a citation from the FA for holding up jet bridge ops because you wanted to inspect a hinge." Russ shook his head. "I need you doing your actual work. Not walking the perimeter like you're auditioning for the TSE," Frank straightened up slowly, the way a man does when his knees have absorbed 22 years of night jumps and hard landings. He looked at Russ for a long moment, not with anger, just with the flat, appraising patience of somebody who'd learned a long time ago that most fights weren't worth having. "Copy that," he said, and went back to the coil. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was, that panic bar has been defeated by somebody who knows exactly how airport access control systems work, and that is not a maintenance problem. That's a vulnerability. But Frank Delaney had spent 2 decades learning that the fastest way to get pulled off a target was to make noise about it before you had proof. So he kept his mouth shut, finished his shift, and started watching. Terminal C's maintenance corridor ran 210 feet beneath the concourse, connecting the baggage handling system to a service stairwell that came up behind the TSA screening checkpoint. A blind spot by design, because nobody wants passengers walking past exposed conduit and hydraulic lines on their way to their gate. Only badge holders were supposed to have access. Catering, custodial, baggage handlers, VAC. And, as Frank had confirmed over 3 separate maintenance calls, somebody who wasn't any of those things. The badge reader logs, which Frank technically wasn't supposed to be pulling, but which the building management system made embarrassingly easy to access from any terminal in the mechanical room, showed a pattern. 3 times in 5 weeks, the tunnel door had been opened with a valid badge, at times when no scheduled catering or cleaning shift was running. Always overnight. Always for less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes was enough time to walk the tunnel, check a hiding spot, and walk back out. Frank didn't report it. Not yet. Because the badge number belonged to a man named Devon Ashby, a night shift ramp supervisor with 6 years of clean service and a photo on the break room wall from an employee appreciation barbecue, grinning next to his 2 kids in matching Sacramento Kings jerseys. Frank had learned a long time ago that when the evidence pointed at someone ordinary, you didn't confront the ordinary person. You found out who they were working for. So for 3 weeks, on his own time, unpaid, using nothing but a laminated maintenance badge and the invisibility that came with being a 61-year-old man in a gray jumpsuit that nobody looked at twice, Frank watched. It was a Tuesday night in March when it stopped being a theory. Frank was pulling a double, covering for a tech out with the flu, running a routine check on the air handlers above the C concourse ceiling grid, a space that put him directly above the employee break area outside the tunnel access door, separated by nothing but a foot of insulation and a drop ceiling tile he'd loosened months ago for exactly this reason. He heard Devon Ashby's voice first. Tight, scared. "I'm not doing this. I told you I'm not doing this." A second voice, older, calm in the specific way that calm gets when it's actually a threat. "You already did it, Devon. You gave us the badge clones. You mapped the blind spots on the CCTV grid. That's conspiracy to commit air piracy. My man, whether the plane leaves the ground or not. You're not walking away from this. You're walking through it. My kids. Your kids are why you're going to do exactly what we say and keep your mouth shut. We're not asking you to hurt anybody. Nobody gets hurt if this goes the way it's supposed to go. We get on that inbound red eye through the tunnel before it reaches the gate during the 15-minute deadhead window while ground crew rotates. We're in the cabin before boarding starts. That's it. You disappear back to the ramp. Nobody ever knows you were part of it." Frank lay motionless above the ceiling tile, breathing shallow through his mouth, doing math he hadn't done in 15 years. Deadhead window, cabin access before boarding, ground crew rotation. This wasn't a smuggling operation. This wasn't cargo theft. Somebody was planning to get armed personnel onto an aircraft through a maintenance blind spot, using an insider to defeat access control, timed to a gap in ground crew coverage, which meant they'd studied the airport's actual operational rhythms, not just its layout. That was not criminal opportunism. That was tradecraft. Frank had spent 2 decades on the other side of exactly this kind of plan, assessing how a hostile actor would exploit a facility's blind spots, how they'd compromise an insider, how they'd time a breach to a scheduling gap that looked like nothing to anybody who didn't know to look for it. He'd written training materials on this. He'd run exercises against it. He counted voices. 2, maybe 3. He couldn't get an eye on them without moving. And moving meant noise, and noise meant tipping his hand before he had anything solid enough to act on. So he did what 22 years had trained into his spine before it had ever been a conscious decision. He got out, quiet and unseen, and he started building a picture instead of a panic. He didn't call the police that night. He'd thought about it in the truck on the drive home, hands steady on the wheel, mind running the kind of calm, procedural loop that used to be called target packet development, and that his ex-wife used to call the thing you do instead of talking to me. A 911 call from a maintenance tech claiming he'd overheard a hijacking plot through a ceiling tile with no names beyond a first name and no aircraft, no date, no flight number. That call got logged. Maybe got a patrol car swinging through employee parking, and got Devon Ashby and whoever he was working with going dark and starting over somewhere else. Somewhere Frank wouldn't be standing on a ceiling grid above the conversation. What he needed was the when. So for the next 9 days, Frank Delaney did his job. He fixed coils. He cleared filters. He let Russ Kowalczyk chew him out twice more for flagging phantom problems in the tunnel. A sensor housing that had been quietly repositioned 2 inches, a maintenance log entry that didn't match the actual work performed. And he took the abuse without defending himself, because every write-up Russ filed was one more piece of paper trail that made Frank look exactly like what he needed to look. Like a paranoid old vac tech nobody took seriously. That was the job now. Being underestimated was the mission. He watched Devon Ashby's schedule. He watched the badge logs, and on the 7th night, in the break room, he did something he almost never did. He sat down across from Devon Ashby and started a conversation. "You got a minute?" Devon looked up from his phone, wary, the particular wariness of a man who'd been flinching at footsteps for 2 weeks. "I'm on break." "Won't take long," Frank set his thermos down. "I fix the units back here 5 days a week. I notice things. I noticed you don't look like a man who's sleeping. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you don't look like it." Frank kept his voice level, unhurried, the same voice he'd once used to talk a 19-year-old kid out of panicking in a stairwell in Ramadi with the whole building coming down around them. "I'm not a cop. I'm not her. I'm a guy who's seen what it looks like when somebody's carrying something they can't put down. You want to put it down. I'm not going anywhere." Devon's hand tightened around his phone. For a second, just a second, something in his face cracked open. Then it closed back up. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Okay," Frank said, and let it go, because pressing now would only teach the boy to run faster. He stood, picked up his thermos. "Door's open, if that changes." He walked away without looking back, and he knew. The way you know a trap has been set correctly. That Devon Ashby would be thinking about that conversation every hour until he broke. Devon broke on a Thursday, in the mechanical room, 20 minutes before his shift, with the door shut behind him and his voice shaking. "They said it's tomorrow night," he said. Flight 1187, the red-eye from Dallas. It gets in at 11:40, deadheads to the gate for cleaning and turnaround, boards for the 6 a.m. departure to Denver. There's a 15-minute window between when ground crew steps off and cabin crew boards. That's when they go through the tunnel and up the service stairwell into the aircraft. How many? 3? Maybe 4. I don't. They don't tell me anything. I don't need to know. I just gave them badge clones for the tunnel door and the stairwell, and I told them the ground crew rotation schedule. Devon's eyes were wet. "They've got something on me." A Dewey 2 years ago, hit and run, nobody ever. I never told anybody. I paid it off, buried it, and then this guy shows up at my door 6 weeks ago with a police report I thought didn't exist anymore, and he says either I help him or my kids watch their dad go to prison and lose everything. I didn't know what to do. You should have come to me 9 days ago. "I didn't know who you were 9 days ago." Frank looked at him for a long moment. Really looked, the way he used to assess a source's reliability, weighing fear against fact, panic against usable information. What he saw was a scared 34-year-old father who'd made one bad decision 2 years ago and gotten leveraged into a second, far worse one, by somebody who understood exactly how to turn a man's love for his kids into a weapon. "What do they want on the plane?" Frank asked. "Passengers? Hostages? A specific person?" "I don't know. I swear to God, I don't know. They never said." That, Frank believed, compartmentalization. Whoever was running this had kept Devon exactly as informed as he needed to be to do his part, and not one fact more. Which told Frank something important. This wasn't amateur hour. Somebody had run an actual operation before. Somebody knew tradecraft. "Okay," Frank said quietly. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to do exactly what they told you to do. You're not going to warn them off. You're not going to disappear. You're not going to do anything different than you've done the last 6 weeks. Because the second they think you've flinched, they either scrub the operation and vanish to try it somewhere else, or they hurt you and your kids to keep you quiet. You understand me? You're not calling the cops? I'm calling exactly the right people, at exactly the right time, in exactly the right order, so that 3 or 4 armed men walk into a stairwell tomorrow night and walk out in handcuffs instead of getting on that aircraft." Frank's voice hadn't risen at all, but something in it had changed. Settled into a register Devon had never heard from the quiet maintenance guy who fixed the AC units. "I need you to trust me on this. Can you do that?" Devon looked at him, really looked, for the first time, and something about the stillness in Frank's eyes, the complete absence of panic in a conversation about an armed plot to seize a commercial aircraft, made him nod. "Who are you?" he asked. "Nobody you need to worry about," Frank said. "Go finish your shift." Frank Delaney made exactly 1 phone call that night, and it wasn't 911. It was to a number he hadn't dialed in 9 years, saved in his phone under a name that meant nothing to anybody who might scroll through it. Marv Vac Supplier. Marv Yates picked up on the second ring, the way people do when the caller id makes their stomach drop a little. Frank Delaney. Damn. Didn't expect to hear this line ring again. I need Homeland Security investigations, not FBI, not local PD. I need somebody who'll actually listen to an operational threat brief instead of taking a witness statement, Frank said. And I need it to go through you, because if I call this into a Sacramento PD non-emergency line, it gets logged as a tip and sat on for review, and I don't have review time. I've got 17 hours. There was a pause. Marv Yates had spent 30 years in the agency's Special Activities Center before retiring to a desk that officially didn't exist inside the Department of Homeland Security, and he knew Frank Delaney's voice well enough to know that if Frank was calling in a favor at 11 p.m. on a work landline, it wasn't a drill. Talk to me, Marv said. Frank talked. Flight number, timing window, access method, insider compromise via blackmail, badge cloning, minimum 3 armed actors. Objective unknown. Possibly hostage-taking. Possibly something aimed at a specific high-value passenger. Possibly a hijacking with a destination change in mind, though Frank suspected, based on the tunnel reconnaissance pattern he'd tracked over 5 weeks, that whoever was running this had scouted for an operational vulnerability first and picked Flight 1187 second. Meaning they wanted access, not that specific plane. Which was, in some ways, worse. It meant they'd take a different flight if this one didn't work. Which meant this had to be stopped tomorrow night, in the tunnel, before anybody set foot on any aircraft. You want to run this yourself, Marv said. It wasn't a question. I want a Homeland Security Tactical Response Team staged and ready to move the second these individuals commit to the tunnel, Frank said. I am not asking to run anything. I'm a 61-year-old vac technician with a bad knee. I am asking you to trust 17 years of working with me that this brief is accurate and to get people who can act on it to a Sacramento Airport service corridor before 6 a.m. tomorrow. Christ, Frank. You're really out there fixing air conditioners. Somebody's got to. The next 20 hours were the longest of Frank's civilian life, and they nearly ended 9 hours early, in the front seat of Devon Ashby's car, in a Costco parking lot, with Devon's hands shaking so hard he could barely hold his phone to his ear. He was in my driveway, Frank. Devon's voice had gone somewhere past, scared, into a flat, hollow register that Frank recognized from 100 other men in 100 other bad moments. This morning, 7:40. My kids were standing at the end of the driveway waiting on the bus, backpacks on, and there's a black Impala just sitting there, not doing anything, not saying anything. He rolled the window down about 2 inches, looked right at me on the porch, and looked at Mia and Tyler standing right next to the mailbox, and then he rolled it back up and drove off. That's it. That's the whole thing. He didn't say one word. He didn't need to, Frank said quietly. He knows where they stand every single morning. He knows what time. He knows their names. Probably. He didn't even have to say it, Frank. He just needed me to see him seeing them. Devon's breath hitched, ragged. I can't do this. I can't gamble my kids on a timeline. Call it off. Tell your guy. Tell Homeland Security. Whoever. Call the flight. Ground it. Cancel it. Do a bomb threat. I don't care. Just make it not happen tonight. Please. Please, Frank. I'll take whatever comes for me. I'm begging you. Not them. Frank sat with that for a long moment. Phone pressed to his ear, standing alone in the mechanical room with the hum of the air handlers around him, and he understood exactly what Devon was asking him to do, because it was the most human thing in the world to ask. It was also, Frank knew with the cold clarity of a man who had made this exact calculation before, in worse places, with worse odds, precisely the reaction the man in the Impala had been counting on. Devon, Listen to me. Frank kept his voice level, the same voice from the break room, unhurried even now. That drive-by this morning wasn't a threat against your kids. It was a threat against tonight. He didn't come to hurt them. He came to make you call somebody exactly like you're calling me right now, and beg them to blow up a timeline that 4 federal agents have already built their whole operation around. If we scrub this now, if a flight gets grounded, if a gate gets evacuated, if anything looks different tonight than it looked yesterday, these men don't go home confused. They go to ground. They vanish with everything they know about you, your address, your kid's bus stop, and they come back in 6 months somewhere we're not standing over the ceiling tile. You don't get to unknow what you know tonight, Devon. There's no version of this where you're safe and this operation just quietly stops. You don't know that. You don't know what he'll do. I know what fear is built to make you do, Frank said. It's built to make you protect what's right in front of you, right now, and hand over what actually keeps them safe long-term to do it. That man sat in your driveway because he needed one thing from you today, and it wasn't compliance. It was panic. He needed you to make exactly the phone call you're making right now. So what? I just let it happen? I let my kids keep standing at that bus stop, not knowing if he's going to be back tomorrow, and the next day. And he doesn't come back tomorrow. Tonight, in about 9 hours, he's either walking into a tunnel in handcuffs or he's not walking at all. And either way, Devon, this ends tonight, not next week. Not after this thing has time to move to a different airport with a different insider and a different family in the crosshairs. Tonight, Frank paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, something that cost him more to say than anything else that night. I can't promise you nothing happens to your family between now and 11:52 p.m. I won't lie to you and tell you that's zero risk, because I've been in rooms where somebody promised me that and they were wrong, and good people paid for it. What I can tell you is that every hour between now and then, with them expecting an insider who's still playing his part, is an hour where you and your kids are safer than you will ever be if this operation goes dark tonight and starts over somewhere I'm not standing. There was a long silence on the line, filled with nothing but Devon's ragged breathing and, somewhere behind it, the sound of a kid's cartoon playing faintly through a closed door. You're asking me to bet their lives on your read of a stranger's intentions. Yes, Frank said, because there was no version of that sentence that wasn't true, and he had never once in 22 years found it useful to lie to a man about the actual weight of what he was asking. I am, and I'm telling you I would not ask it if I weren't willing to carry it myself. If I'm wrong tonight, Devon, it's not my life on that line. It's not my kids at that bus stop tomorrow morning. It's yours. I know exactly what I'm asking you to trust me with, and I am not asking lightly. Another silence, longer this time. Okay, Devon finally said, so quiet Frank almost missed it. Okay, but if anything happens to them tonight because of this, then that's mine to answer for the rest of my life, Frank said. But it won't. Go pick your kids up from school like it's any other Thursday. Let them see your face be normal. That's the only thing you can do for them right now that actually helps. Frank hung up, set the phone down on the mechanical room workbench, and stood there alone for a moment with both hands braced flat against the cold metal, feeling. For the first time since he'd traded a rifle for a wrench. The specific, solitary weight of a command decision made with somebody else's children on the other end of it. He had made calls like this before, 100 times, in places where the stakes were written in blood and nobody back home ever knew his name for it. He had never once made one alone, without a chain of command above him to share the weight, without a team beside him to say, I've got your 6 on this. Tonight, there was just him, a dented steel thermos, and a decision he'd have to live with either way. He picked up the phone again and called Marv Yates. Anything change? Marv asked. No, Frank said. Just make sure your people are exactly where they're supposed to be. Nothing slips tonight. Nothing. Russ Kowalczyk noticed none of it. He spent the day writing Frank up for a fourth complaint about the tunnel access door, muttering about getting corporate to finally do something about this guy, completely unaware that the man he was disciplining had spent the last 9 days quietly running a counter-surveillance operation that federal agents were now staging around, and had spent that same afternoon making the loneliest phone call of his civilian life, trusting his own judgment over a terrified father's plea because somebody had to. At 11:15 p.m., Frank was exactly where he was supposed to be. In the mechanical room above the break area, doing exactly nothing that would look unusual to anyone watching, which was the hardest kind of waiting there was. At 11:38, Flight 1187 touched down. At 11:52, 3 men in reflective vests that didn't quite match the airline's actual uniform contract. A detail Frank had flagged to She 2 days earlier, because he'd pulled the vendor spec sheet just to be sure, badged through the tunnel access door using a cloned credential. She let them get 11 feet into the corridor, far enough that retreat wasn't a clean option, far enough from the aircraft that no passenger was ever at risk. There was no gunfight, no cinematic standoff. Just 4 agents coming out of 2 service closets Frank himself had identified as blind spot choke points during his surveillance, weapons up, voices sharp and controlled, and 3 men who'd planned meticulously for an airport's weaknesses, and not at all for the possibility that someone inside those weaknesses had been watching them the whole time. It was over in under 90 seconds. Frank didn't come down from the mechanical room until it was. The first thing he did, before he even climbed down from the ceiling grid, was pull out his phone and text a single line to Devon Ashby. "It's done. Go check on your kids. They're safe. So are you." The story that made the local news the next morning was thin and mostly wrong, the way these stories always are in the first cycle. Federal agents foil suspected airport security breach at Sacramento Metro. No names, no mention of a maintenance tech. No mention of a night shift ramp supervisor who'd spent 6 weeks living in terrified silence, or of a black Impala sitting in a driveway at 7:40 in the morning. But Russ Kowalczyk found out a different way. 2 days later, he was called into a conference room by the airport's director of operations, along with a man in a plain gray suit who introduced himself only as, with the Department of Homeland Security, and a woman from corporate legal who looked like she hadn't slept. "We need to talk about Frank Delaney," the director said. Russ's stomach dropped in the specific way a man's stomach drops when he senses, correctly, that he is about to be told he was wrong about something in a way that cannot be walked back. Is he in some kind of trouble? He identified and helped stop an attempted breach of a commercial aircraft, the man in the gray suit said, flat and unhurried. His threat assessment, his surveillance discipline, and his operational timeline were, in the professional opinion of everyone who reviewed this file, better than most of what we get from trained analysts. We'd like to know how a maintenance technician produced work like that. Russ opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "You've written him up 4 times this year," the director said, sliding a folder across the table. Russ's own paperwork, his own complaints, laid out and annotated. Every single incident you flagged as him overreaching or creating phantom problems was him identifying a genuine security vulnerability weeks before it became operational. The tunnel door, the sensor housing, the maintenance log discrepancy. He wrote every one of them up through proper channels, and you disciplined him for it. I didn't know. "No," the man in the gray suit said. "You didn't, because you never asked him why he was doing it. You just decided he was a problem." Frank was in the mechanical room, elbow deep in a condenser unit, when Russ found him that afternoon. He didn't turn around right away, which gave Russ a second too long to stand in the doorway, not knowing what to say. A novel experience for a man who'd built a career on always knowing what to say to the people under him. "They told me," Russ finally managed. "Homeland Security. They told me who you were, what you did, before this. I didn't do anything most guys on that crew wouldn't have done if they'd known what to look for." "That's not, Frank, that's not what I mean." Russ ran a hand over his face. "I wrote you up 4 times, for doing your job better than anybody I've ever supervised, and I called it overreaching because I didn't understand what I was looking at. Frank finally turned around, wiping his hands on a rag, and there was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction at being proven right, just the same tired, patient calm he'd had every single day Russ had chewed him out. "You supervised what you could see," Frank said. "I spent 22 years being the guy nobody was supposed to see. That's not a knock on you, Russ. That's just what the job was." "What was the job?" Frank considered the question the way he considered most things, slowly, and only after deciding whether the answer was worth giving. Special Activities Center, Saya Paramilitary. 22 years, mostly places that don't officially exist on a map, doing things that don't officially get written down. He shrugged, an old man's shrug, tired in the joints. "I retired 6 years ago. Came home to an empty house and a government pension that doesn't ask you how you're sleeping. Took this job because I'm good with my hands. I like fixing things that are actually fixable, and nobody asks me follow-up questions about a maintenance ticket." And the tunnel door. 22 years of assessing infrastructure vulnerability doesn't just switch off because you traded a rifle for a wrench, Frank said. "I saw a defeated panic bar and a badge access pattern that didn't make sense. And some part of me that never really came home just started working the problem, same as it always did." Russ was quiet for a long moment. "I owe you an apology. 4 of them, actually." "You don't owe me anything," Frank said, and meant it. "You did your job the way you understood it. I did mine the way I understood it. Sometimes those 2 things look like a conflict until they don't. I want to fix this. The write-ups, I mean. Get them pulled from your file, put in a commendation instead." "I don't need a commendation, Russ." Frank picked his rag back up, turned back toward the coil, because standing around talking about himself had never once in his life felt comfortable. "What I need is for that panic bar fixed for real this time, and maybe when the next tech on this crew flags something that seems small, somebody actually listens before deciding it's nothing." Devon Ashby kept his job, high C in the UDAT attorney's office, weighing 6 weeks of coerced compliance against genuine, voluntary, case-breaking cooperation, declined to pursue charges. A decision Frank had personally lobbied for, sitting across a table from federal prosecutors and explaining, in the flat, unemotional cadence of a man who'd once written debriefing reports for a living, exactly how blackmail works and exactly how much courage. It had taken a terrified father to walk into a mechanical room and tell the truth to a stranger in a gray jumpsuit. And exactly how much more courage it had taken that same father to sit with his hands shaking in a parking lot and, in the end, trust that stranger's judgment over his own instinct to grab his kids and run. Devon never fully understood, until the day the case closed, just how close Frank had come to letting him call it off, and how deliberately Frank had chosen not to. When he finally asked, in the break room, weeks later, why Frank hadn't just gotten the flight grounded that afternoon, Frank only said, "Because grounding it would have protected you for one night and cost you the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. I wasn't willing to trade you a short peace for a long war." Devon didn't have anything to say back to that. He just nodded, the way a man nods when he finally understands a decision that once felt unbearable. The men behind the plot, 3 with military contracting backgrounds, 1 with a documented history of extremist affiliations, all of them still being unwound by investigators months later, connected to a pattern of attempted breaches at 2 other regional airports that had gone unnoticed until Sacramento's failure became their first real trace, were denied bail and were, as of Frank's last conversation, with Marv Yates, looking at federal sentences that would keep them well out of circulation for a very long time. The man who had sat in the black Impala in Devon's driveway was among them, identified through cell site data that placed his phone within a quarter mile of Devon's house at 7:41 that morning. One more piece of evidence Frank had quietly made sure got into the right hands. Frank never gave an interview, never appeared in a single news segment. When a reporter tracked him down in the employee parking lot 2 weeks later, thermos in hand, he said only, "I fix air conditioners," got in his truck, and drove home. But every tech on his crew learned to knock on the mechanical room door before they walked in, and every one of them, without ever being told why, started treating the quiet, scarred-handed old man who flagged 3 times as many maintenance tickets as anyone else with something that looked a lot like respect. Russ Kowalczyk got the panic bar replaced within a week. He also started ending every shift briefing the same way, whether anybody understood why or not. If something looks wrong to you, even a little wrong, even if you can't explain why, write it up. I don't care how many tickets it makes. I'd rather have 40 phantom problems than miss the one that isn't. Frank Delaney never heard him say it. He was usually in the crawl space above the ceiling tiles by then, checking a filter, listening, the way he always would for the rest of his life, for the sound of something that didn't quite belong.